They started out as places to fear, with good reason. But these days, for many folks, they are an escape from the hassles of modern life. Hi, I'm Bruce Reichert, and welcome to Outdoor Idaho. Many of us can't name all the wilderness areas in the state, like this one here at Craters of the Moon. But for many of us, the concept of wilderness raises important questions about our public lands and about our role in managing special places.
It's been called an American invention, this concept of wilderness. In that respect, it's similar to another American invention, the national park. America setting aside the best of what defines us as a nation. In the 50s and 60s, Americans realized that wild, undeveloped landscapes were disappearing at an alarming rate, and that soon every nook and cranny on the continent could be touched by human endeavor. For some, the solution was something called designated wilderness, essentially taking public land out of the hands of federal agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and protecting it by an act of Congress signed by the president.
To endure the political winds was going to take an act of Congress to set this up and not leave it just to the agencies to manage. And the whole emphasis behind the Wilderness Act was that leaving it to agency flexibility wasn't going to cut it. They didn't like it. They were opposed to wilderness right up till the bitter end. I would argue they saw the inevitability of it.
It took more than 60 rewrites and 18 public hearings stretching over 9 years, and lots of compromise to hammer out an acceptable wilderness bill. It also took the leadership of Idaho Senator Frank Church to shepherd the bill through the U.S. Senate. But finally, in September of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act into law. At the heart of the legislation was this one sentence, describing wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. By the stroke of a pen, 9 million acres of wild land entered the National Wilderness Preservation System. We should be guardians, not gardeners, explained the drafter of the bill, Howard Zahniser. Among that first group of wilderness areas in 1964, the largest was in Idaho, called the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness. It stretches west from the lofty peaks along the Idaho-Montana border and north toward Highway 12. It's a rugged landscape encompassing huge stands of old-growth forests, imposing granite ridges and countless creeks and streams. Most of those rushing waters flow into the river at the heart of this wilderness, the Selway. This river was one of the 8 original waterways protected by the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And here at the Paradise launch site, whitewater rafters can begin a trip that takes them down nearly 50 miles of this wild river.
It's important for people from all walks of life to experience a true wilderness environment, and just the opportunity for the camaraderie of the river.
Ken Masoner has been experiencing that camaraderie on this river for more than 40 years. His father, Elwood, was one of the first outfitters to get a permit to run the Selway, and that was in the early days of rafting this river back in 1971.
We had to learn how to run all of these rapids. There were not maps, of course. We helped to make the maps. I think the Forest Service has done a really good job and been on top of this because they recognize this as being the precious jewel of all of the wild and scenic rivers.
And to help keep the Selway pristine, the Forest Service only allows 1 launch a day during the rafting season.
I always liked the fact that only 1 trip went a day.
Lead guide Dennis Jesse has been taking groups down the Selway for 2 decades.
I don't think it's for everybody, but I think everyone should get a taste of it and understand, okay, civilization versus wilderness, there is a big difference. You're on your own out here, and you got to be really self-sufficient. I really think that's what makes it true wilderness.
Thousands of rafters apply for permits to raft the Selway Wilderness. But with only 60 private launch dates and 16 commercial trips, a small percentage of boaters actually get on the river.
With only one launch a day, we typically don't see anybody. There's a group a day ahead of you, there's a group a day behind you. You have the river to yourself for 5 days. You often won't see anybody else out here. It's the most sought after guiding job in the state, I would say. It is class 4 at higher water, it's pushing 4 plus, class 5. It's, I'd say, a half notch harder than the Middle Fork, and it has a steeper gradient. It's about 28 feet a mile.
Guests find their way to the Selway from all over the world. On this trip, the group includes a California couple and a family from Arkansas.
I like to go to places that not many people visit and places that you get to see and do things that are really special. This is something I really felt was important for my family that will last for a long time in their minds, and something that's epic. And that's what we have done here.
The trip really gets epic at the midway point when the waters of Moose Creek nearly double the size of the Selway. The turbulent stretch below is known as Moose Juice, and it includes one of the state's most famous rapids.
Ladle is a rapid that a lot of trips have ended on for people. Ladle is a boulder field, and it changes quite a bit, so you're always scouting Ladle. In high water, it's a lot of pour-overs, really dangerous hydraulics, really confusing to find a line in. It is a puzzle. Most people that first see it are like, what? Where do we go? How do we do this? And that entry is probably the most critical thing, getting in the right spot to start. And then you drop in, and plan A might become plan B really quickly. Bump one rock and your line changed. And there are not a lot of options down in there. You want to get through all the rocks above and then straighten out for the big hole at the bottom. That's where every guide wants to be, down there looking up. It's so much more fun from that angle.
When I first come to this river, it got in my blood. And this river is almost like an artery in my life, to my soul, my body. It keeps me going. I haven't experienced a lot of other places, but this is heaven to me. That's kind of all I need to know. Forever, this will be my home.
The Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness is large, 1.3 million acres. But there is an even larger wilderness to the south of it, one that encompasses much of the River of No Return, as well as its famous tributary, the Middle Fork of the Salmon. Its boundaries reflected the desire to protect water quality and habitat for salmon and steelhead, and habitat for bighorn sheep and mountain goats as well. To ecologists, the beauty of these large areas is that natural processes can play out on a grand scale, even when that's not a comfortable thing to watch. Today, many of us think of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness as an indispensable part of the Idaho story. But dig a little deeper and you'll discover that it was incredibly controversial, and one of the reasons Frank Church lost his seat in the U.S. Senate in 1980. In fact, Church was the only one of the Idaho delegation to vote for the River of No Return Wilderness bill. After all, this is more than 2.3 million acres. And for the most part, critics contend, it is locked up. But the Forest Service does manage the 10,000 people who each year float the 100 miles of the Middle Fork of the Salmon. And it is possible to jet boat up part of the main Salmon River, or fly into some of the tiny airstrips scattered throughout the forest. But out here, it's pretty much a hands-off philosophy. One of those called upon to oversee the Frank, as it's come to be called, was Earl Dodds. He served as the Big Creek District Ranger from 1958 until his retirement in 1984. He remembers the change from Forest Service primitive area to congressionally designated wilderness.
One of the things we started on was a program of pack it in, pack it out. And that was kind of a radical change here.
That's because just about everyone, including outfitters and the Forest Service, buried their garbage in the woods. Today, pack it in, pack it out is standard operating procedure.
I'm really kind of proud of the American public and the way they have changed their ways here.
Another thing that changed, no power equipment.
That was one of the first things we did, get rid of our own power equipment, our own power saws and lawnmowers and generators to set the example. And it wasn't easy. We wrote quite a few violations for the use of power saws before we got that job done.
But perhaps the biggest change with wilderness was how wildfires were now allowed to burn. At first, this was hard for Earl Dodds to accept. But today, he and most Forest Service officials do accept the role of fire as a management tool. In fact, the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Tom Tidwell, believes we need to use even more fire.
Fire is part of the ecosystem, and it is the only tool we have to be able to restore the health and resiliency of these systems. And luckily, like here in Idaho and the Frank Church and also in the Selway-Bitterroot, we've seen the difference by being able to manage natural fires. So today when we get a large fire started, yes, it burns, but it'll burn into one of the old burns, it slows down, it creeps across there, and we're able then to have fire in the system to help promote the overall health.
Some call wilderness a spiritual necessity, a place where you can regain your equilibrium. Still, you have to wonder why anyone would hike across sharp, twisted lava, where the footing is treacherous, the water scarce, and the likelihood of sleeping on something soft and comfortable disappears with each step into the unknown.
The main objective was to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. Closest friends and family thought it was a little bit risky that we go out and try this. But it's been done before, back in the 20s, and we figured we could do it again 90 years later.
That's right, somebody did hike this 60-plus miles once before, back when no one knew what was out here. Robert Limbert's journey in 1921 convinced President Calvin Coolidge to use the Antiquities Act of 1906 to establish Craters of the Moon as a national monument. Some 50 years later, Congress created wilderness inside that monument. It was, surprisingly, the very first designated wilderness ever managed by the National Park Service. As you can imagine, the difficulty out here is water, finding it when you need it.
The only time you ever see water on the surface is if there is an ice floor holding it up. If that ice melts away, the water is immediately soaked up by the lava rock. We do have a few of these along the way, so we'll be able to refill our water bottles along the way. I think people that really get to know this landscape can describe it as being beautiful, whereas on first blush, it seems so harsh and difficult that those adjectives may not immediately come to mind.
3,000 years ago, this area was flowing and red hot, similar to what's now occurring in Kilauea in Hawaii. The basalt lava flows here sprang from a series of fissures across the Snake River Plain, known as the Great Rift. It's been called the strangest 75 square miles on the North American continent. And geologists say, don't be surprised if Craters of the Moon erupts again. But for now, the lava here is stationary and hard, and to some people, kind of boring. But photographer Craig Wolfrom has no trouble finding fascinating textures and patterns.
It's this unknown island. It's neat to be one of the first modern people to go across the entire rift and across the entire flow and explore it.
Wolfram and fellow hiker Allison Konkowski are particularly fascinated by the lava caves.
The biologist back at the park wants us to kind of keep track of caves that may have potential for hibernating bats. The last few months has really been my first experience with caving, and I really have kind of fallen in love with it. It's kind of addicting, so it's really cool to check out these lava tubes that maybe some people have never been in before.
Yesterday I found one and I jumped right in, and in my excitement realized that I might have been the first human being in that spot in the last 2,000 years, and I had to really pull myself back and say, wait a second, are there artifacts? Are there pictographs or petroglyphs? Is there anything of cultural importance? Because literally 2,000 years might have gone by and not a single human had been there. It's definitely a special moment.
It's a real treat to find color in the crevices among these lava flows, and some plants seem to thrive out here, especially in the spring.
There's something like 700 plant species documented from craters of the moon. They've adapted to these conditions. Junipers are one of the longest-lived plant species on Earth. I'm sure the one we saw at Old Juniper Kapuka yesterday was well over 1,000 years old.
This is one of those trips you'd like to say, yeah, I did it, and I'm glad I did it. And if they say, would you like to do it again? You go, I think I've got the memories. Tip of the hat to Robert Limbert and all the other folks that have had maybe spectacular and sometimes horrific and terrifying experiences out here in this truly wild landscape, because it is a wild place.
Long way down.
If you like your wilderness with soaring peaks and hundreds of high alpine lakes, then maybe the Sawtooth Wilderness is for you. Back in the 1970s, the Sawtooths came close to being Idaho's first and only national park. Some people still wish that had happened, while many more figure this area dodged a bullet. That this fragile landscape would have been overrun by hordes of national park visitors. Studies suggest the clearest air in the continental U.S. is here in the Sawtooth Wilderness. And this is also the source of several major rivers. Water doesn't get any cleaner. No wonder it's the favorite Idaho wilderness for hikers.
Somewhere out there. Mm-hmm. Right here at this junction, and we're going to go like that to Alpine Lake, and then we're going to go really up right there.
Lots of switchbacks.
Like 15 of them. And then we go another mile to there.
This is one of the most accessible of all the wildernesses in the West, where you can have a mocha in the morning, head out for a strenuous hike in wilderness, and be back in town for a decent meal before dark. 300 plus miles of trails in the Sawtooth Wilderness definitely do get used. Especially this 10-mile round-trip trail to Alpine and Sawtooth Lake, with an elevation gain of about 1,700 feet.
It's rocky, it's jagged, it's rugged, it's wild, and I think that that's what, for me, makes the Sawtooths really stand out.
I had heard a lot of people talk about Sawtooth Lake, that it was a nice trail, and saying how beautiful it was. But really, I didn't hear people talk about when you're hiking up the switchbacks and you look and you see all the teeth, the big teeth, you know, what we talk about with the sawtooths. I hadn't heard people talk about that. And I was like, holy smokes, this is just unbelievable. To be surrounded by this basin of just these teeth coming up and then looking into Alpine Lake at the same time. That was just absolutely stunning.
This is my first trip to Sawtooth Lake. I knew it was beautiful before we came up here, but when you come over the hill and you're hiking into it and you're coming into the drainage, you just get to that wow moment. It's extremely beautiful. It's such a big lake. That's really special.
This lake is spectacular because there's no one here. There aren't any structures. There aren't any motorboats on the lake. And it looks like the mountain just grows right out of Sawtooth Lake. And also the size is pretty impressive for being up so high.
I don't have words for how amazing it is to just be here and know that I can come back here and it'll still be like this.
I grew up in a city, so this is not necessarily something I'm used to, but something that I greatly appreciate and couldn't ask for a better place to be in my backyard.
Wilderness is important to Idaho because it represents the true heart of what Idaho is. It's wild country. That's what makes wilderness so important to Idaho.
The author Terry Tempest Williams called the Wilderness Act a way of caring beyond ourselves and beyond our own species. Only 2 other states have more wilderness than Idaho, Alaska and California. If we never added another acre of designated wilderness, Idahoans could still lay claim to having done their part. We have looked into the future, embracing other species as well. We have looked beyond ourselves and even beyond our own time.
Funding for Outdoor Idaho is made possible by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, by the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore's legacy of helping to build the great state of Idaho, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, by the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, committed to the conservation of Idaho's lands and waters, and by the Idaho Public Television Endowment. To find more information about these shows, visit us at idahoptv.org.